people who were healthy at baseline, higher anger and hostility carried about a 19% increase in coronary heart disease. This is a type of research where you take people who have already had a cardiac event, you ask what they were doing in the couple hours beforehand, and then you compare that window against the same person at the same time of day on a controlled day. Welcome to Sammillerscience, where you're joining me nearly 2 decades into my personal journey to bridge the gap between macros, metabolism, muscle, and medicine. If you're joining me, thanks for trusting me to elevate your health and realize your true potential. Each week and inside every episode, I'll be sharing methods and models from my coaching journey and my personal experience, as well as the science that you need to achieve whatever specific goals you're working on in your life. Let's jump in to today's show. Are angry people aging faster from the inside out? In the 2 hours after an anger outburst, your risk of a heart attack jumps almost fivefold. But there aren't just short-term implications. This impacts your long-term health as well. Having a temper is a legitimate longevity risk factor that not enough people are talking about. I've seen this play out firsthand. In my family, the one guy who happens to have the heart issues, has a history of a stroke, and has a pacemaker was also the angriest. Now, this is more correlation than causation, but admittedly, most of us treat a short temper like it's just a personality trait, like the same as waking up early being an early riser, or you're forgetful and bad with names. But the evidence suggests that anger could actually be aging us at a cellular level from the inside out. In 2024, my dad had a stroke, and this was after years and years of cardiovascular health problems. He was also one of the angriest people that I've ever been around and had the shortest fuse. I have no way to prove that the anger necessarily caused the stroke, but when we look at the physiological mechanisms in his health history and the new research, it looks more and more like it possibly did. An anger episode starts in the amygdala. This is the fear center of the brain, and this flags the situation as a threat before you have consciously decided to do anything about it. It signals the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus fires the sympathetic nervous system, and within a second or two, your adrenal glands are then putting adrenaline and noradrenaline into circulation. This is also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Your heart rate begins to climb. This is basically an alertness response, and in this process, the heart contracts harder, peripheral blood vessels constrict, and blood pressure rises from both ends of that equation at once. Your blood also gets measurably stickier, so platelets aggregate more readily, the viscosity increases, and all of this is basically just a survival mechanism because thousands of years ago, if something in front of you had teeth and you happen to have an injury and you were about to be opened up, that would be a good thing. But in today's day and age with chronic low-grade stress all the time, that's not a good thing. Coronary arteries are supposed to dilate when the heart is working harder. In an artery whose lining is already damaged, that response can invert and the vessel constricts instead at the exact moment that the heart is actually demanding more blood through it. If you put those factors together in somebody carrying unstable plaque, then the pressure spike actually raises shear stress along the arterial wall. The fibrous cap over the plaque tears. The material underneath is suddenly exposed to blood that has been primed to clot, and then platelets pile into it. That is how these heart attack or cardiovascular events happen and why the 2-hour window exists instead of just talking about this over 20 years. When you experience repeated sympathetic activation and repeated cortisol release, this is something that moves markers inside of us in terms of our physiology and things you could track in blood work that most cardiology journals are already aware of. Hey everyone, if you're listening to today's episode or you regularly find value in the content, if it's educational, entertaining, or changes your perspective about certain health topics, the greatest compliment that you could give my team and I is a rating and review. Also sharing the show with any friends or like-minded potential listeners who might benefit from the content that we share here. My team and I invest loads of resources into producing this production for you every single month without the influence of outside sponsors who potentially could negatively influence the education and type of content that comes straight from me to you. A lot of podcasts in the health and fitness space, every 5 minutes you're having to hear about a different product or commercial or supplement that you're supposed to buy or something you need to put in your house. And that's not the way that it is here. My team and I bring you the latest and most relevant health information to support you as you work towards your goals. Or if you're someone who's a health and fitness professional and you coach others, you can take this directly back to your business for clinical application or even in the content that you share. So help us continue the ripple effect of this health information by sharing it and supporting it with that rating and review. Without further ado, let's jump back into today's podcast. In cases of chronic sympathetic activation, low-grade inflammation rises. So this could be measured as something like interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine, or C-reactive protein, which is an acute phase reactant. The endothelium, the single lining of every blood vessel you have, loses some of its ability to dilate on demand. Resting blood pressure also tends to gradually get higher, and inflammation is what drives plaque formation to begin with. In this way, we can see that anger has its own sort of signature inside of these physiological responses, is slightly different than someone just having temporary fear or short-lived anxiety. Fear tends to raise cardiac output while vasculature opens to move blood to the legs. Anger raises cardiac output and vascular resistance together, so you get the pressure spike from both directions at once, which is why the hemodynamic profile does the most to an artery wall. The epidemiology research matches what you'd expect from studying the physiological mechanisms that we've outlined so far in today's episode. Two researchers by the name of Cheetah and Steptoe pooled the prospective studies in the Journal of American College of Cardiology in 2009. They took hostility, and hostility was scored first, and cardiac events were counted years later. In people who were healthy at baseline, higher anger and hostility carried about a 19% increase in coronary heart disease. In people who had already had coronary disease, about 24% increase in poor outcomes was observed. The researchers have also studied these variables and physiological effects by using a design called a case crossover. This is a type of research where you take people who have already had a cardiac event, you ask what they were doing in the couple hours beforehand, and then you compare that window against the same person at the same time of day on a control day. So they account for things like genetics, blood pressure, smoking, history, diet, and all of those factors actually stay the same. They're constant because it's the same person who's being used in the comparison. When you pull this across studies, risk of myocardial infarction in the 2 hours following an anger outburst came in around 4.7 times the baseline, and stroke was at about 3.6 times the baseline. So these results represent what we're seeing in observational data in humans, but let's talk about what's actually happening and unfolding at a cellular level. Chromosomes end in a repeating stretch of DNA called a telomere, which you've probably heard of if you follow any longevity science or people who talk about biohacking and things like that. But a telomere basically works like the plastic tip of a shoelace, keeping the coding sequence from unraveling and keeping the cell from reading the end of the chromosome as damage. Every division shortens that tip a little bit, and when it gets short enough, the cell stops dividing and shifts into a senescent state, where it stays alive and starts secreting inflammatory signals into the tissue around it. Telomere length is the closest thing that we have as basically an odometer for that process, and there's an enzyme called telomerase that adds length back to the telomere with activity that moves depending on what's happening to the organism. A researcher named Eppel opened this area of study in 2004 with 58 women. 39 of them were caring for a chronically ill child or family member at home, and 19 of them were controls in this study. The women reporting the highest chronic stress had shorter telomere, lower telomerase activity, and more oxidative damage than the women reporting the least, and that length difference translated into something on the order of a decade of additional cellular aging. So this is pretty powerful, and that looks more at chronic stress in women. Now, there's other research and specific work that we need to look at as well. In what's known as the Whitehall cohort, 434 men were scored for cynical hostility, and the ones who scored higher had shorter telomeres alongside elevated telomerase activity, which reads as a repair system running hot and still losing ground. A separate study of roughly 1,000 people put the hostility-associated gap somewhere between 1 and 4 years of cellular aging and found the relationship depended on sex and on health status rather than holding uniformly across the sample. The association also turned up again in a group of U.S. war veterans. Several of these research pieces suggest that chronic stress exposure and cellular aging are linked, but the objection that you'll hear is that, well, Sam, none of these are randomized controlled trials, or what about human randomized controlled trials, which in nutrition research or types of training is totally feasible. But for this type of study on this topic, that trial can't necessarily exist. Randomizing 500 people into 10 years of engineered rage while a control group lives calmly is not something that an ethics board or institutional review board will approve for researchers to study or give funding for, and it's not something that a human or university could reasonably conduct for years on end. The evidence hierarchy in this field tops out below randomized controlled trials, and that's why we have to use cross-sectional studies, epidemiology, and physiological mechanisms to develop our understanding of the issue and this relationship between anger and temper and someone's cellular health and longevity. So if anyone says that anger doesn't cause shortened lifespan, the claim you actually can defend and what you can say here is that anger is an established acute cardiac trigger. That hostility carries a modest independent increase in cardiovascular risk over years, and that chronic psychological stress shows a small consistent association with markers of cellular aging. What you can't say is that a person's specific temper is aging them by a specific number of years or causing a certain type of death, or that fixing it will add a measurable amount of time to their life. But there's still some practical implications here, and I think it's pretty directionally aligned with the research and just common sense. Now let's discuss some practical implications of what would happen if someone starts to work on their temper, emotional regulation, and anger, and how that's going to impact their health. So typically what we'll see first is improvements in resting heart rate and heart rate variability. This will probably respond within a few weeks, and you'd be able to observe this on any type of wearable device or heart rate monitor. Sleep quality and time to fall asleep are probably going to move similarly and around that same time window. So your sleep latency may improve and sleep quality could improve. Now your blood pressure may take longer depending on the person and other lifestyle factors like caffeine consumption, smoking, alcohol, and what they're doing with their diet and exercise. But remember, as far as anger goes, somebody who flares and is back at baseline in 5 minutes is a completely different physiological exposure than someone who takes 40 minutes and a beer or multiple drinks to calm down, because the cortisol curve is what determines how much of the day is spent in that heightened state or that alertness response. So when having these discussions or when thinking about anger, either for yourself or a loved one, think about the duration and exposure as the incident. As far as cellular health, I'd stay away from consumer telomere testing entirely. The reliability across labs isn't really that good enough yet for a single result to tell one person anything useful. It can be expensive, and the cellular research belongs in the journal articles for now. It's not something you need to be regularly testing in your day-to-day life at this point in time. The most relevant biomarkers to track if you're trying to take some tangible data points from this episode would be things like resting heart rate, HRV, blood pressure, highly sensitive C-reactive protein, and occasionally running a 4-point cortisol test, and then keeping an eye on insulin sensitivity, so your fasting insulin, A1C, and fasted glucose. You can check blood pressure at a local grocery store or pharmacy, or even keep a cuff on hand at home. They're not super expensive, but that's a way to have your eyes on that metric outside of just your resting heart rate. Outside of checking your pulse or having a wearable device, those are some other biomarkers you can look for. You can unlock more of physiology like this inside our functional nutrition and metabolism specialization program for health coaches and health professionals. You'll work with me and my team, working real cases alongside other practitioners, running into the same problems and building the reasoning rather than just handing people cookie cutter protocols. The application link is in the show notes, or you can head over to metabolismschool.com to learn more about our program. If you enjoyed this episode, if you learned something new, if it changed your perspective or kind of reframed even a life experience or the impact on cellular aging and longevity, please share the show or send it to someone who would benefit. It only takes 2 seconds to support the content my team and I share here. And you can also do that by leaving a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen, or a thumbs up on YouTube. We had over 300,000 streams last month, and I'm pretty sure like over 80% of you guys are not subscribed. So smash that subscribe button to make sure you never miss an episode. You get first dibs on all our latest research and metabolic health updates. Download some episodes for when you're not on Wi-Fi so you can listen on the go. And we're one of the few shows in the health industry that's not just constantly running random ads for greens powders and supplement affiliate codes and different companies that change every 30 days. We put this content together specifically for you and to translate some of these complex concepts into leverage for your goals or your clients' goals. I appreciate you guys tuning in today. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next show.